Daniel Harper was a man who thrived on the strange and unusual. A writer by trade who had crafted his name on ghost stories and tales of haunted towns that readers couldn't put down. Yet, despite all the eerie worlds he had woven from his imagination, nothing could have prepared him for the uncharted, forgotten village he stumbled upon when his car, quite stubbornly, decided to die on a misty road at twilight. "Of course," Daniel muttered, glancing around at the dense forest pressing in on either side of the road. The last bar of battery on his phone mocked him, flickering out as if to confirm he was truly and thoroughly stranded. The only thing nearby was a dirt road leading toward a small collection of cottages that looked as though they had been plucked straight out of the Victorian era. Curious and without many options, he headed down the path, trying not to trip on the protruding roots snaking across the ground. The village emerged from the fog like a stage set, too quaint to be real, with ivy-covered walls, cobblestone streets, and an eerie quiet that made every small sound echo tenfold. As Daniel approached the first cottage, an old man with a scraggly beard and wide, almost gleeful eyes appeared at the window, staring at him as if he'd been expecting him. Daniel waved nervously, and the old man waved back with an exaggerated excitement that made his skin crawl. "Welcome back, Daniel," the man said, voice muffled behind the glass, but his enthusiasm somehow unsettling. Daniel stopped in his tracks. Back? He didn't recall ever stepping foot in this odd storybook village. Maybe he had one of those familiar faces, or maybe the locals were just in the habit of greeting strangers like long-lost friends. He shook it off and continued down the narrow lane. The people of the village began to emerge, one by one, and the effect was nothing short of unnerving. It was as though each resident had choreographed their entrance, timing it to perfection, some popping out of windows, others stepping out from doorways or peeking around corners, all with the same warm yet slightly off-kilter smiles. "Good to see you again, Daniel," chirped a woman carrying a basket of what looked like dried herbs. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. "Didn't expect you so soon, dear." Hi," Daniel replied, keeping his smile polite, trying to mask the growing discomfort that gripped him. "Lovely place you have here. Though, I don't think I've been here before." The woman's smile widened, just a bit too far, and her laugh was thin like an old recording. "Oh, Daniel, always the joker." She patted his arm as if they were old friends. "Your room's ready, of course. Margaret has kept it just the way you like." Without quite understanding how, Daniel found himself being ushered along by the growing crowd of villagers, each greeting him as though he were some kind of celebrity returned home after a long absence. Despite his insistence that he was only passing through, they all seemed delighted to ignore him, leading him toward the inn as if he had no choice but to follow. The inn was an old stone building, its sign swaying slightly in the wind, with the word Willowmere etched in faded letters. Inside it smelled of old wood, dust, and something faintly floral. A stout, elderly woman with a neat bun and a face so wrinkled it seemed to hide her eyes bustled out from behind the counter. "There you are, Daniel," she said with a fond sigh, clasping her hands in front of her. "It's been so long. Welcome home." "Right," Daniel mumbled, half laughing despite his nerves. "Funny thing, but I really don't remember this place." "Oh, you will," she said with a mysterious smile. "You always do." And with that, she handed him an old iron key attached to a leather fob, its edges worn down from use. Despite every alarm bell ringing in his head, Daniel climbed the creaking stairs, curious despite himself. His assigned room was at the end of the hall, and as he pushed open the door, he felt a strange wave of nostalgia, as though he had stepped into a place that existed somewhere in the foggiest corners of his mind. The walls were lined with dark wooden panels, and the bed, covered in an ancient quilt, looked inviting enough. But what caught his attention was a small, battered desk in the corner, upon which sat a dusty journal and a quill. Odd. Very odd. He walked over to the desk and picked up the journal. Opening it, he saw a few faded entries, notes on various towns and people, strange snippets of folklore he vaguely recognized. And there, In the margin of the very first page, he saw his own handwriting. "Welcome back, Daniel. Finish the story this time." That night, sleep was a hopeless endeavor. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the window seemed amplified in the silence, and Daniel's mind was racing with the villager's odd familiarity and the journal's ominous note. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thoughts slipping between reality and something darker, half wishing he could forget everything he'd seen since arriving. But curiosity, it always got the best of him. Around midnight, just as he was drifting off, the whispering began. It was soft at first, like leaves rustling or distant voices carried by the wind. But slowly, it grew louder, more distinct. Daniel bolted upright, his eyes darting around the dark room. There was no one there, yet the whispers persisted, filling his ears with a low, overlapping hum of words he couldn't quite make out. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, drifting through the floorboards, the walls, the very air he was breathing. Desperate for answers, he grabbed the journal, his fingers trembling slightly as he flipped through the pages. The entries grew darker, filled with strange, disjointed lines, snippets of ominous warnings about the dark harvest and the keeper. His own handwriting became frantic, almost feverish, until he could barely recognize it as his own. But there, at the bottom of one of the pages, a scrawled line caught his attention. "You promised to finish their story. You promised to set them free." "What the hell does that mean?" he muttered under his breath, though the hairs on the back of his neck prickled with the unsettling sensation that someone, or something, was listening. The whispers grew louder, almost demanding, urging him to continue reading. He leafed through the journal until he found a detailed passage describing a ritual, the Dark Harvest, a mysterious ceremony involving all the villagers, a keeper figure who presided over it, and, somehow, him. The entry was half finished, cut off abruptly with a smudged line trailing off the page, as though his past self had been forced to stop mid-sentence. The whispers seemed to grow in intensity, each word clearer, repeating phrases that had been scrawled in his own hand. "Finish the story," they chanted in a ghostly murmur, voices blending together, an overlapping chorus that gnawed at his sanity. There was something desperate in the voices, as though they were pleading with him, begging him to end the cycle, to release them from something he couldn't yet comprehend. Unable to take it any longer, he threw the journal across the room, heart pounding. As it hit the floor, the whispers fell silent, replaced by an even more unnerving quiet that settled thick and heavy in the air. Just as he was about to exhale, the door to his room creaked open. Standing there was Margaret, the innkeeper, her face twisted in an expression of eerie calm, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "It's time, Daniel," she said, her voice soft, yet chilling. "The village has waited long enough." The next day, Daniel felt like a prisoner on a leash. The villagers were everywhere, appearing around every corner with those same unsettling smiles and knowing looks. They followed him silently, as though guiding him to places he had forgotten. Every time he tried to leave, another villager would block his path, offering cryptic comments or eerie stories that left him feeling more entangled in their strange web. In the afternoon, as the mist grew thicker, Daniel found himself led to an old library at the edge of the village, a crumbling building that looked as if it hadn't been touched in years. Its windows were dusty, its roof sagging under the weight of years. But the doors swung open as if by some invisible force, beckoning him inside. The villagers stood behind him, their eyes urging him forward. Inside, the smell of decayed paper and mold filled his nose, and shelves lined with ancient tomes loomed like silent sentries in the dim light. As he wandered through the aisles, he found a small alcove where a single journal, nearly identical to the one in his room, lay open on a pedestal, its pages worn and fragile. He approached it slowly, heart pounding. When he saw the handwriting on the pages, he felt a jolt of recognition. It was his own. The journal described his previous visit to Willowmere, a visit he had no memory of, but the details were chillingly specific. Each page recounted interactions with the villagers, descriptions of rituals, and the role he had played in their lives. Apparently, he had promised to write their story, to document their lives and their plight, so that they could finally find peace. But he had left before the story was complete, abandoning them to some strange suspended existence where they lived out his half-finished script, repeating the same events, the same words, waiting for him to return. In the final entry, he had written a line that echoed in his mind as he read it. They're not just characters. They're real. And they're trapped in my story. A loud creak broke the silence, and he turned to see the villagers gathering at the library entrance, their faces somber, their eyes dark with an emotion that bordered on anger and sorrow. Margaret stepped forward, her voice a soft yet menacing whisper. "Finish what you started, Daniel," she said, her gaze piercing. "We need an ending." Daniel stared at Margaret, words caught in his throat. The truth of the villagers' plight was sinking in. He had left them here, unwittingly trapped in the unfinished world of his own creation. They weren't just characters. They were lives, suspended between his words, incomplete and waiting for release. Panic swelled in his chest as he realized the implications. He had to finish the story. But how? What would he write? The villagers stepped closer, encircling him, their eyes like hollow windows to the anguish they'd endured. Margaret extended her hand, a gnarled finger pointing to the journal on the pedestal. "Write the ending, Daniel. Complete the story, so we may finally rest." Daniel's hands shook as he picked up the journal and the quill beside it. A million thoughts raced through his mind, each one grasping for an escape from this nightmare. But there was no way out. He knew, deep down, that he was bound to this place, to these people. The ink flowed as he began to write, his hand moving almost on its own, guided by some force beyond his control. As he wrote, the room seemed to change. Shadows flickered along the walls, and the villagers' faces contorted into strange expressions of relief, anticipation, and, disturbingly, something darker, almost as if they were savoring what was to come. Daniel could feel the weight of the story bearing down on him, every word pulling him further into the depths of Willomir's twisted reality. The journal entries poured from his mind, capturing the final events of the village, detailing each villager's fate, as if he were transcribing a tale already written. In his story, Willomir's last chapter unfolded in a grim scene of the Dark Harvest, a ritual meant to bind the village's life force to the land. It was supposed to protect the village for eternity, but the ritual had gone wrong. The keeper, a shadowed figure that Daniel had half created and half feared in his previous visit, demanded a sacrifice that hadn't been fulfilled. The village had been plunged into an eternal loop, cursed to repeat the same day over and over until Daniel, the one who had started the tale, returned to finish what he had begun. The more he wrote, the clearer it became. His words carried weight, shaping the lives and deaths of each villager as he penned the lines. His hand moved faster, the ink flowing as if possessed, describing the villagers' fates in haunting detail. Margaret, the devoted innkeeper, would finally see peace, her face softening in gratitude even as her form began to fade. The old man who had first greeted him at the window gave a strange, twisted grin as he disappeared into a wisp of smoke, his face finally serene. Daniel was caught in the relentless pace of the story, unable to stop, even as his hand cramped and his heart pounded. The villagers' faces flickered in and out, their expressions a haunting blend of satisfaction and resignation. But just as he reached the final lines, something shifted. The shadows deepened, and an eerie silence filled the room. He looked up to see the villagers watching him intently, their faces frozen in expressions that seemed to speak of betrayal, anger, and hunger. Margaret stepped forward, her eyes glinting with something dark. "Thank you, Daniel," she said, her voice soft and laced with an edge of malice. But you must finish the keeper's role. You must take on his duty now, for there must always be a keeper in Willowmere." A cold realization washed over him. The story wasn't just about releasing them. It was about replacing the role he had left vacant. The keeper, the figure he had thought was just a shadowed memory, a fragment of his imagination, was a real entity, a force bound to the village's fate. And now that he had completed the story, that role had to be filled. By him. As Daniel backed away, clutching the journal to his chest, the villagers closed in, their faces twisting into grotesque smiles, their features distorting as if something dark and ancient was surfacing within them. His hands trembled, heart racing as he tried to comprehend the weight of what he'd done. He had set them free, yes, but he had also locked himself into their curse. There was no escape. He was now part of the story, bound to Willowmere as its new keeper. In a final act of desperation, Daniel tried to tear out the last page of the journal, thinking that if he could destroy it, perhaps he could undo the curse. But the page wouldn't budge, held fast as though glued by an invisible force. The villager's hands reached for him, cold as death, guiding him back to the desk, back to the journal, back to his new reality. "Welcome, Keeper," Margaret whispered, her voice echoing as if from the depths of a dark void. The last thing Daniel saw before the shadows consumed him was the reflection of himself in the dusty mirror, wearing the Keeper's robe, his face gaunt, hollow-eyed, and twisted into a smile that wasn't his own. And then, darkness. The next morning, a new traveler arrived at Willowmere, lost and looking for help. The villagers greeted him with warm smiles, eyes glinting with a familiarity that sent chills down the stranger's spine. The fog was thick that morning, swirling in ghostly tendrils as the new traveler, a young man named Evan, pulled his dusty car into the tiny village of Willowmere. His engine had sputtered to a halt just outside the village, and he'd walked in, following the faint glow of lights through the mist. As he made his way down the cobblestone street, a sense of déjà vu crept over him, though he couldn't place why. The whole town looked like it had been left behind in another century, with ivy creeping up the walls and the smell of something faintly floral hanging in the chilly air. He noticed the first villager, a little girl with hollow eyes and an unsettlingly wide smile, who stood just outside one of the cottages, watching him with an expression of delight that made him hesitate. Before he could think to turn back, others began to emerge, one by one, all smiling, all staring at him as though he were the answer to a question they'd been pondering for years. "Welcome," they said in unison, the word hanging in the air with an unsettling calm. A shiver ran down Evan's spine, but he forced a polite smile. "Hi. Is there a mechanic or maybe a phone I could use?" he asked, feeling a little foolish in front of their silent stares. "Oh, we'll take care of you, dear," said a stout woman with a neat bun, her eyes glinting with something he couldn't quite place. "We've been expecting you." She gestured toward the inn, her smile stretching wider. Thanks," Evan said, not sure whether to feel reassured or alarmed. He entered the inn, feeling like he had walked into some kind of strange dream. The scent of old wood and dust wrapped around him, and on the wall, a picture caught his eye. A black and white photograph of a man staring out with haunted eyes dressed in a dark flowing robe. There was something about him that seemed strangely familiar, almost like looking into a mirror. As he stared, the innkeeper, who introduced himself as Daniel Harper with an odd little smile, stepped up beside him. "Ah, yes," Daniel said, his voice soft and almost distant. "That was our last keeper, the one who, had to leave." Evan chuckled nervously. "So are you all just welcoming tourists who get stranded here?" Daniel's eyes glinted, his smile widening slightly. "Oh, something like that. Though," he added with a soft laugh, "around here, it's usually the tourists that end up doing the welcoming, eventually." The other villagers began to file into the inn, surrounding Evan in a semicircle, their faces alight with that same peculiar, hungry curiosity. Margaret, the stout innkeeper, gave Evan a nod as if to say, "Welcome to your new life. and handed him a dusty leather journal and a quill. "Take a seat," she said, her eyes twinkling. "It's time to start your story." Evan laughed uncertainly, thinking it was some kind of local joke. But when he sat down and touched the journal, a strange warmth radiated from its pages. He glanced around, meeting the villagers' expectant stares, his heart beginning to race. "Wait, what exactly is this?" he asked, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. Daniel's smile grew wider, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Oh, you'll find out soon enough," he said, leaning in close. "But let's just say that in Willowmere, we all have our parts to play, and yours is just beginning." As Evan felt an inexplicable compulsion to write, the villagers began to retreat, one by one, their faces lit with satisfaction. He could hear the faintest whisper in the back of his mind, a chorus of voices saying, "Finish the story. Finish the story." And just before he put pen to paper, Daniel gave a light pat on his shoulder and said, with an almost friendly smirk, "Don't worry. Once you're in Willowmere, the story never really ends. In fact, it has a way of writing itself." Evan's laugh was more a nervous stammer. "You're all joking, right?" Daniel gave a wink, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Oh, absolutely. Just don't mind the shadows. And if you hear whispers, well," he shrugged with a mischievous smile, "just consider them creative inspiration." As Daniel left, the journal lay open before Evan, the quill trembling in his hand, as if guided by invisible fingers.